In South African legislation, the state is mandated to provide services to assist women who are victims of abuse. But in reality, implementation of these services is slow, inconsistent, and sometimes non-existent. Women's abuse shelters are one of the services that have been found to be the most effective in disrupting the cycle of domestic violence.
So shelters disrupt violence perpetrated against women and children. How do you do that?
If you look at the concept itself, it is a place of safety. So when a woman needs to escape the violence, when she's at the point where she's ready to leave, because we must also understand the cycle of violence as well. It is a psychological trauma as well to be trapped in a cycle of violence. So when you come into the shelter, you are attempting to break that cycle. And when you are with us, part of what we do is education. Part of what we do is to also share with you what violence is and what are your options available, so that then you can make your decision. How do you carry on forward from there? And I think that is how we disrupt violence in that space, where she's now in a safe space. She's given time to heal. She's also being educated about her rights and also looking at her strengths and allowing her to develop her own agency. And then I think in that way we disrupt violence.
Kwigame yokugqibela ndinayo ipiki phaa efowunini wandibetha ngayo ngentsimbi ngespare wheel. Ntoni laa nto yokhulisa imoto? Wandibetha ngalaa ntsimbi apha, then ndanalaa nto apha, then ndenze i-operation apha ke ngoku eSt Dominus Boss une-medical aid. Ndenzwa i-operation apha kulo mlenze okulicala, then wandikhuphela umpu ke ngoku ndibetha ngawo entloko ukuze kukhale abantwana. Bakhala ke ngoku abantwana. Yonke le nto yenzeka abantwana bekhona. Ndithi ukuze ndisinde ndingadutyulwa ngalo mpu kube kanti kukho abantwana. So ndaphela ke ngoku ndisiza eshelter ngoba kaloku ndibaleka ubulawa because uthe uzawundibulala ubekhe ndimdivosa. Ndamdivosa kulo nyaka kupheleyo, ndaphinda ndoyichitha idivosi endicenga uba mandichithe le divosi. Ndicengwa nabantu basekhaya uba ayikho le nto ndiyenzileyo. Ngoku ndichithile idivosi katshintshi lo mntu caba ebengafuna ulahlekelwa mhlawumbi. Ndathi ndoyicinga ebengafuna ulahlekelwa, ebefuna into yoba mandichithe le divosi. Ezinye izinto zibe khona into azaziguqula zingabizi yena.
Xa umane uyiripota ezinto emapoliseni bebetrita njani?
Emapoliseni bendiye ngoku ngoba ndilapha eshelter kulo nyaka upheleyo wenzelwa i-protection order. But laa mfana ugqitha ngapha kwe-protection order ngumntu, laa mfana ngumntu ongathi ligintsa. Akho polisa angalaziyo, akanapolisa angalaziyo. Andisho amapolisa arongo, uyaqonda, but arongo ngenye ixesha ngoba uneetshomi izikakhulu zingamapolisa, because unomntana wakhe owambamba ngesapoti, but zange laa mntana akwazi uba kanti anganikwa laa mali ngenxa yento yoba esazi umntu ophaa ekhothi oyitshomi yakhe wamvela wamnika imali. Uyayibona, wamnika i-7,000 uba akulinge ayinyuse le mali, ungaziphindi inyuse le mali, ayiphelele kule 150. Uyayibona, so ibingahambeli indawo into yam, but yahambi wakwazi uhambela ndawo kuba ndiye eScenery Park ndomenzela i-protection order khona, but ebegqitha ngapha kwayo.
While shelters play a critical role in disrupting domestic violence, the current funding model is not adequate to sustain these organizations, with many shelters being funded per bed without taking into account the numerous services necessary to assist survivors of domestic violence to get back on their feet.
If I think of our monthly costs, we are a 15-bed shelter, so that means we can accommodate up to 15 women and their children. And then we have a staff ratio to that, so it would be myself as the shelter manager, we have our full-time social worker, and then we have 4 house mothers, and they work on a 3-day on, 3-day off ratio for 12-hour shifts. and then we also have a cleaner on staff as well. And then part of our costs, because when you come to the shelter, we provide, we try and provide to all your basic needs. So that would be your accommodation, food, should you need clothing, if you need support in terms of getting ID documents, marriage certificates if you want to apply for a divorce, or the children need birth certificates so we can place them in schools. We provide that money, and then also where a lot of the women would go back to their family homes, which are in predominantly rural areas because of where we are in the Eastern Cape, and then we will provide that monetary support as well. And then just looking at our administration costs and everything, for us we're looking at over 100,000 rand a month.
Enhancing state responsiveness to gender-based violence, paying the true costs, was a 3-year research study by the Heinrich Boell Foundation and the National Shelter Movement of South Africa to investigate the role that shelters play in disrupting abuse, to look at what is needed for it to work more effectively, and also interrogate the state's roles and responsibilities in regard to this.
So this project that we call Enhancing the State's Response to Gender-Based Violence, Paying the True Costs, is actually stems from an earlier project which we did between 2011 and 2013, where we were looking at the police's response and the court's response to domestic violence. But there was one particular aspect. For example, the Domestic Violence Act says that the police must refer or try and assist women to access shelters. But there's actually no legislation which talks about now how are those shelters going to exist. There's no mention of funding, for example. So this only exists within policy. The government has a duty to provide shelters, but that also means that if shelters must exist, the services must also be of adequate quality. So we started our research then in Western Cape and Gauteng, and we were trying to see is what are the profile of women and their children accessing shelters, and can those shelters meet those needs within the context of funding by government. So we were finding that government was funding shelters at a unit rate. At the time, it was really low. It was at 28 Rand and 30 cents in Western Cape, for example. And there was some funding towards the employment of a social worker and house mothers, etc. But it was really low. And part of the difficulties with government is that they recognize that they need to fund these services. But within the framework of NGOs, they expect NGOs to make up the shortfall. And that's kind of problematic because, I mean, I use this analogy often. If there's a hole in a road and government contracts a service provider to come fill that hole, he won't say you pay, we'll give you 20% of the cost of fixing that hole and you must cover the 80% that is remaining to cover the cost of that. So if that doesn't happen within that kind of context, why is it that NGOs, for example, have to bear the brunt of that in meeting services that are technically government's responsibility? So we can understand, you know, that government can't fund everything. We have so many needs that it is impossible to do so. But if NGOs cannot raise the shortfall, then they cannot deliver the services, and that means we are doing a disservice to victims of violence.
Yeah, it was a struggle to see, it was a struggle to get police officials to firstly recognize the Domestic Violence Act, you know, and work accordingly to the Domestic Violence Act. The same happened with the courts. Magistrates, they were used to giving so much attention to the Criminal Procedure Act that they neglected these other small acts like the Domestic Violence Act, the Children's Act. And I think it fell upon us working in this field to make them see that these
no act is more more important than the other act, because it boils down to the constitution and the rights of people. So that was the fight that we had to fought, to get people to recognize these acts and do exactly what is supposed to be in this act. The same with even other stakeholders, that had a role to play, making the community recognize that there is help outside. There is acts in place. It's just that people are not implementing them correctly.
In 1998, South Africa passed the Domestic Violence Act, a product of Section 12C of the Constitution that states, everyone has the right to freedom and security of person. That includes the right to be free from violence. 20 years later, in 2018, while progressive on paper, implementation of the Act is problematic, with structural and cultural issues and perceptions often restricting or denying women access to their rights.
There was a case recently where a woman spent her birthday trying to get a protection order the day before her birthday, and she was killed on her birthday. Horrific, and that is part of the problem. Actually, women, we've got good laws, but they're not implemented, and the police don't actually come to the party because they don't arrest the perpetrators. We had one who found the house and was harassing us and making a noise. Police came and they said they couldn't take him away, but there was a warrant of arrest. So the police aren't properly educated as well about what needs to be done. And then we had a case in the office where a woman, her partner sent her a message to say that he'd got a protection order against her, and she said, no, she got the protection order. She sent him a message to say, I got the protection order. He sent the police to arrest her for that, and the police actually responded to that. So that was just completely ludicrous when women are being murdered, beaten, and to get the police to actually respond. It's unbelievable.
I think, if we look at not just SAPS, but all our structures, we speak of structural patriarchy. So we speak of instances where there's no understanding of women's issues, there's no understanding of what affects women and how certain things affect women. So when we talk about our structures now, we're talking about our government. If we go straight to the top, how many women are in the executive, how many women are in the legislature, and that's our representatives of of who we elected to be in charge. And then so when they take decisions, are they taking women's issues into account?
Women's abuse shelters provide a safe physical and emotional reprieve for survivors of abuse, and often fill the gaps between state departments to increase access and speed up service delivery for abused women.
At one point when I got here, people did not access the shelter because they did not want to go to the police in the first place, to lay a charge or to ask for assistance, because they were always turned away. So that was one of the things that we had to do. I had to go physically to the police station and speak to the police, the station commander, and tell them that we won't tolerate people not being assisted at the police station. At the Department of Justice, we won't tolerate people having to wait a month for a protection order after having applied for a protection order. Those kind of challenges we have experienced. We started conversations with the station commanders. Conversations such as what is working and what is not working. And there were a lot of challenges because we also realized, and we had to acknowledge the fact that the police officer, SAPs have their own challenges. Like there's not always a police vehicle able, on hand to bring a victim to a shelter. Not all the police officials, especially in the charge office, are properly trained when it gets to matters of domestic violence. So we had to start that conversation.
What do you think can be done to address gender-based violence in South Africa?
I think a lot can be done, and it starts with the children, because the most thing that I've learned being here is we're dealing with these women, they're being abused, and the children suffer more and they go back. Some of them, not all of them, but some of them, and you can actually see the signs in the children when the children are abused. The children swear and they fight and those things. I think a lot can be done at schools, you know, because most of us don't even know what abuse is. We always thought that abuse is like eating someone. We never knew that there was sexual abuse, there was like emotional abuse, like financial abuse, all those sort of things. Because abuse doesn't mean just to be hit and you have a blue eye, and then it means you are abused.
Recently, I read a report, a research that was done by the Institute of Security Studies, and they looked at men who were incarcerated for 15 years and more from various racial backgrounds, where they perpetrated extensive trauma and violence. And all of them grew up in abusive environment. And so that just gives you an idea that if we don't stop this cycle, it perpetuates into the next generation.